Hi, uh, welcome to another seminar at the MOS convention. I am super excited to be here, and I get to talk to you about one of my favorite things, the Maryland and DC Breeding Bird Atlas. So I'm going to be telling you about strategies for more effective atlasing. So first, I'll just give you a general background on the Breeding Bird Atlas here. This is the third one that's been done in the region. There was one in the 80s and one in the 2000s. And the idea behind these projects is basically to map out where birds are breeding in a given region. And an atlas is just a mapping effort. So you've got a world atlas, you've got a road atlas, you've got a breeding bird atlas. So the great thing about repeating these every couple of decades is that you're able to see how a bird's distribution has changed over time. And you can link that to things like land use or habitat changes. Our project is looking at the distribution and the abundance and the timing of birds breeding in Maryland and DC. You can see that there's a white grid map in the middle of this slide. This is the whole region, Maryland and DC, divided up into 3 by 3 mile blocks. And we do that to distribute observer effort across the entire region and get observers into every single corner of the area. So an atlas is an incredibly thorough, precise mapping effort. And it requires tens of thousands of volunteer hours to pull it off. So it's a really tremendous thing to hold and to finish. So once it is done, you can take the data and you can use them to document population changes. You can identify important areas for a species, for a group of species, and you can identify species at risk. So this talk is going to be focused on focused atlasing. This is going to be about just going out and having a plan and trying to be very efficient in your atlasing. There's a lot of ways to atlas, as long as you are being careful and submitting quality data. You can atlas any way that you like. I'm just going to tailor this talk towards kind of that more focused, getting it done sort of perspective. So atlasing and birding, they're both very similar things. Both things are about going out and identifying birds, trying to find them. And they're very similar, but they're not quite the same thing. So they're kind of opposite ends of the spectrum to some extent. Atlasing, you can think of more like slow birding. You have to be very patient. You're going out and you're just watching an individual bird. You're seeing what it does and how likely it is to be breeding. It's not about, chasing down rarities and that kind of thing, which is the opposite end of the spectrum, which would be like listing, So you don't need to be an expert birder with the biggest life list to be a good atlaser. You just have to be patient and watch individual birds to see what they're doing. As long as you're doing that, you're being careful with your observations, you're asking questions. If you don't know something, you're going to be submitting really good quality data to the project. So an atlas, obviously, we want to document breeding, and the easiest way to do that would be to find bird nests, right? But birds are really good at hiding their nests, and so that's difficult and takes a lot of time. So to get around that, we can use a bird's behavior to determine how likely it is to be breeding. And so we divide up every observation of a bird into 4 different breeding statuses, okay? And this is just based on the kind of behavior that you saw. how good of evidence was it that the bird is actually breeding there? If you just see a bird and it doesn't do anything related to breeding, well, then that just is an observed bird. You just saw it. If you saw a bird that was in the right place at the right time, that's a possible bird. It might be breeding there, but it's not very good evidence. If you see behavior that suggests that breeding is probably nearby, something like a pair of birds or birds that are doing a courtship display or something like that, that's probable breeding. And of course, if you do find a nest or young chicks or something like that, well, you know that breeding happened nearby, and that is a confirmed observation. So to collect the data for this project, we use the eBird platform. eBird is a community science project. There's a few 100,000 observers who contribute data to it, pretty much all bird watchers. eBird is very popular in the birding community because it allows you to go out to a location and submit a list of all the birds that you saw from that location. You can record what species you saw, how many of them there were, where exactly you were, how long you were out there for. And if you're using the app, it even keeps track of a lot of these things for you, like how far you walked. It's a really great platform, and it fits perfectly with the kind of things that the Atlas is looking for. So we're using eBird to collect all of our data. Now, the one thing that, if you are familiar with eBird, that you have to know about to contribute data to the Atlas is that there's an Atlas portal. And you can see that there's this figure on the slide. It's a series of 4 screenshots from the app. And if you want to change the portal, this is how you would do it. You just go into settings and you'd select the Maryland DC Breeding Bird Atlas. But you don't have to worry too much about, writing this all down right now. This is all available on the website to show you how to do it. We only use checklists that have been submitted through this portal because if someone has gone and selected the portal, that's an indication to us that they know some of the protocols that we're asking people to do. They know how to use breeding codes appropriately. They know things like only reporting birds during their breeding season, if they're breeding, or staying within block boundaries, things like that. But all that the portal really is a label that says Maryland DC Breeding Bird Atlas. If you want to submit a checklist from a web browser to the portal, instead of going to ebird.org, you would just go to ebird.org/Atlas MDDC. If you just Google it, it will come up. So I mentioned earlier about blocks and how the whole region is divided up into these 3 by 3 mile blocks. One of the things that, if you're atlasing, that you have to pay attention to is where the boundaries of a block are. The reason for this is that blocks are used to map out the breeding distribution of each species. So when you submit observations from a location of different birds, we want to know that, okay, all of those birds were seen at that location in that block. But if you start from that location and go into a different block, and all of the birds that you're seeing, you're still reporting on that checklist, it'll show all of those birds from both of those blocks as being only from one block, which, of course, if you're trying to map out where birds are, is a bit of a problem. So what we're looking for then is just for you to pay attention to where the block boundaries are and start a new checklist if you cross a block boundary. Now, that's great. How do you do that? On the right-hand side here, I've got a screenshot of the app, and up in the top left of that screenshot, it'll show you how far you've traveled and how long your checklist has been running for. If you tap that, it'll open up a map, and it'll show you where you are in relation to the block boundaries. So as long as you're paying attention to that, you should be good. The other thing to keep in mind is to be careful when you're using hotspots. So eBird locations are separated into personal locations, which are basically a location that's just for you, and hotspots, which are generally like they're public locations on eBird that everybody contributes their data to. And it's a great way to pool checklists together and be able to see, in one location, all the birds that have been spotted at an area. But we are focused on, what birds have been found in a particular block. And sometimes the area that a hotspot covers is in multiple blocks. And so you have to be careful if you're submitting your checklist to a hotspot that the hotspot's in the same block that you were in. Just something to keep in mind. It's easy to forget about this stuff. The other thing that you can do to help stay within block boundaries, all the blocks are 3 miles by 3 miles. If you keep your checklist short, we recommend less than 3 miles. That helps to avoid crossing block boundaries. So how are we doing? We've had a year under our belts. Where does the atlas stand right now? This is data from 2020, from January to December. These are all of the hours of effort that observers put in. There were nearly 40,000 hours of atlasing effort put in 2020, which is that's just outstanding. The brighter the blue is for each block, that's the more hours that went in. The darker blue, the fewer the hours. And if there's a block that looks kind of grayish, that means that there's no data for those blocks. So you can see that most of the effort has been kind of focused in that Washington-Baltimore corridor area, which makes sense because that's where most of the population of Maryland lives. So as we move forward with the atlas, we'll be looking to kind of expand that out from that corridor area. Here's another way to look at it. This is species richness. So that's just how many species were found in a given block. The brighter the color, the more species that there were. You can see that this is a little bit more evenly spread out than the effort map looks like it is. But you're still seeing, that Baltimore-Washington corridor that has kind of the brightest colors, and that makes sense because a lot more effort was put into that area. And then you've also got some of the biodiverse areas, the areas where there really are a lot of birds of different species, like Garrett County. Those are looking brighter as well. So we're off to a really good start. After just a single year of atlasing, we will work towards kind of smoothing the map out to make it look more uniform, but I couldn't be more pleased with how things are after our first year. One of the things that is most useful when you're out atlasing is knowing when a bird is normally breeding in an area. And this can sometimes be kind of difficult information to track down. You can usually find it without too much trouble at like a continent scale, but finding it more locally can be challenging. So we've created this breeding timeline, and you can get this on the website. And what this shows is it shows the overlap of the migration of every species and when the species is breeding here in Maryland, Maryland and DC. And so the dark green dashed line, that represents the breeding period for every species on this image. The light green solid line, that's the migration. And you can see that some species, they pretty much, they arrive here and they start breeding. Other species, there's a lot of overlap. So you can have a species that, you've got some birds nesting while other birds are migrating through. The reason that that's important is because it makes it difficult to know if you just see a bird in good habitat, is that a bird that might be breeding there, or is it just a migrant? And so what we encourage people to do is to wait until migration is over to report weak codes, like a bird that's just in the right place at the right time. And so for some species, that's a very short window. And for other species, it's quite a bit longer. The breeding timeline can be hugely useful for figuring out when a bird is likely to be breeding in an area. These are all of the breeding codes that we use. So a breeding code is just how we categorize breeding behavior. If we didn't have these categories, everybody would just be writing comments about what they saw, and it would be really hard to figure out what a bird is doing. If we have a breeding code, well, then we know that, okay, code H, that is a bird that is in the right habitat. And so we've got 22 of them here. And I know what you're thinking. That is a lot. How am I ever going to learn all of those things? It's pretty overwhelming to look at that wall of codes. The good news is you don't really need to learn them all. What you really want to do is just kind of become generally familiar with them. Kind of like how you would become generally familiar with the birds in a new area in a field guide before you traveled it, right? You probably aren't going to memorize everything about all of them, but you're going to have a general idea of what to expect when you go looking there. And so that's kind of what I would recommend, is that you become generally familiar with the different kinds of codes so that when you see a behavior, you generally know what sort of thing you need to, what sort of code you need to be looking for. So I'm going to run through some of the different groups of codes and give a little bit of background on them and some explanation on when to use them. So code H in breeding habitat, that is kind of the most basic of the codes. That's a bird that is in the right place at the right time and nothing much more. This is a code that you really should only be using after migration has finished, because it's just a bird that's in the right place. And that time aspect is very important. You also want to be careful with birds that travel a long ways from their nest site for food. Things like vultures, herons, terns, gulls. All of those birds, you have to be very careful with using the H code, because we're trying to document which blocks a bird is breeding in. And so if it's traveling a long way from the nest, it will be in a different block. If a bird is at the right place at the right time and it's singing, you have a couple of different options. First, there's just the singing code. That one is pretty self-explanatory. Then you've got the S7 code. This one is really, really useful. If a bird, and it has to be the same bird, if a bird has been singing for a week or more in the same place, that's a really good indication that it's setting up a territory there. And so you can use this S7 code, which is a probable status code. And you'll remember that probable status means that there's likely breeding somewhere nearby. This can be a great code to use when you go into a block, especially if there's a lot of private land and it's hard to get off the road or something. And so you're just hearing birds. Come back a week later and you can upgrade those species to probable status. The last singing related code is multiple birds. If you hear 7 or more birds singing in the same block on the same day, you can use that code. It's really not used a whole lot, but it can be very useful for common birds, like say red-eyed vireos or cardinals or red-winged blackbirds. That's where it really shines. It shouldn't be used for rare species or even less common ones. If you've got a couple of birds that are interacting, you can use code P for a pair of birds, or C, birds that are copulating or displaying. These ones are also good to use after migration has wrapped up, especially the pair code, because it can be really challenging to know whether two birds are a pair or not. They need to be adults and they need to be male and female. Sometimes you can't tell that. There's an image here of two black vultures perched together. Are these a pair of vultures, or are they just two vultures that happen to be together? That's really difficult to know. And you can use that code if migration has wrapped up and most of the population is breeding. Things to look for courtship displays include individuals that are dancing together. Often males will offer a gift of food or maybe nesting material to a female. Females will often do a wing quivering like a fledgling would. And sometimes birds will duet with each other. If you've got birds that are interacting, but it's an aggressive interaction, there's three codes here that you could use. Territorial code, that's if you've got birds of the same species that are interacting. So if one robin is attacking another robin, that is a great use of code T, territorial bird. You just want to be careful when you use this code that you're not, that it's not happening in a foraging area. So often interactions at a bird feeder, for example, aren't a good place to use code T. If you've got a bird that is acting aggressively towards a bird of a different species, it's not being territorial. We'd call that agitated. So this is code A. And so an agitated bird they've perceived a threat, a predator, and they want to drive that predator away. Again, this doesn't really apply in foraging areas like a bird feeder. The opposite to agitated is a distraction display. This is also, a perceived threat to the bird, and the bird is trying to do something about it. But instead of acting aggressively towards the threat, it's trying to lure the threat away. Sometimes these aren't easy to tell apart. This nighthawk on this rock, is it an agitated nighthawk, or is it doing a distraction display? I don't know. And so if you're not sure, you should just go with the agitated code, because it's a probable status code, and distraction display is a confirmed code. Code PE, this is physiological evidence. That just means what's the bird's body condition. This is a really neat one. It's awesome to see a brood patch, which is what birds use to incubate their eggs, or a cloacal protuberance, which is how they'll store the sperm in the breeding season. But you kind of have to have the bird in the hand to see those things. And so this is used a lot by bird banders. Most atlasers don't use this code much at all. If you do use it, make sure you include comments about why, and pictures are great. You can use it if you find an egg just kind of randomly, but you need to make sure of your identification of the egg. Egg identification can be difficult, so be positive before you use it. If you've got a bird that is probably going to a nest site, that's a good place to use code N. It's going into nesting habitat. If it's doing it multiple times, that's an excellent indicator. It's going to the same place over and over. Or if it's going into a cavity, a hole in a tree or something like that, and it's a cavity nesting species, that is also a great place to use code N. If you've got a bird that's building a nest, you've got three things that you can pick from. They're pretty self-explanatory. Code B is kind of a funky one. It's just used for wrens and woodpeckers that are nest building. The reason is because wrens will build multiple nests, and they only use one. These are called dummy nests. And woodpeckers will excavate nest holes as well as roost cavities. So if you see those two, either wrens or woodpeckers nest building, it's not quite the same as seeing other species nest building. If you see a bird that is carrying nest material, this could be a branch or it could just be spider web. You can use the carrying nest material. Just be cautious with birds that are foraging. If a bird picks up, say, a piece of grass or something, that doesn't mean that it's carrying nesting material. It needs to actually carry it away. And then, of course, if you see a bird that is building its nest, well, you can use the nest building code. If you've got a bird that is using the nest is done being constructed, and say you see the adult sitting on it, you can use occupied nest. If you can see the eggs, well, then you can use nest with eggs. And if you've got chicks in the nest with young. These are some of the best codes. I mean, both from a confirmation point of view, can't argue with that, right? But also from an excitement point of view. There's nothing better than finding a bird nest. It's the most satisfying feeling. It feels very intimate to get to witness that. If you find an old nest that is no longer being used, you can use this UN code. It should be used after the bird is done with the nest. This is a good one for using in the wintertime, finding things like oriole nests or other distinctive nests. Nest identification is tricky. And so you need to be sure of the identification before you use this code. And you should always include good comments or pictures explaining why you picked this species for that nest. Now, if you find a baby bird, you got a chick, that's a confirmation that the bird was nesting in that block. The only thing that you have to kind of make a decision on is whether the bird is old enough to have traveled further from the nest site that it's out of the block that it hatched in. That requires some discretion, and experience helps with that. But basically, if you see a bird and it looks like a baby bird, you can use the fledged young code, FL. Things to look for include like a really short tail. Often they'll have kind of where the bill hinges, it'll look fleshy and yellow there. They'll often have bits of down still on them. If it looks like a baby bird, you can use the code. If it looks a little bit older than that, then, if you're not sure, you can either leave it not coded, or you can talk to your county coordinator about it, and they'll be able to help you out. If you see an adult feeding it, then you can use code FY, feeding young. No question about that, because the adult is still taking care of its chick. If you see birds carrying something that isn't nesting material, most birds eat their food right when they find it. So if they're carrying food, they're carrying it to their chick. Just use caution with, terns, raptors, including owls, and crows, jays, ravens. They will carry food. The other thing that birds will sometimes carry is a fecal sac. When chicks poop, they do it into a sack that the adults can carry away. And so the adults will carry it, usually it's just like 50 or 100 feet, something like that, and then they drop it. And it usually looks like a white spot on the bill. And often, because they don't carry it for very far, you can see them drop it. So that's it. Those are all the codes. And so if you kind of have an idea of what you're looking for when you go out atlasing, it can help you make the decision about which code to pick. Now, when do you use a breeding code? You want to use a code when it accurately reflects reading behavior, not just behavior. right? And we've kind of talked about this throughout this presentation. If a bird is singing, for example, but it's still migrating, you don't want to record that as possible breeding. You just want to, have that as an observed bird. So time of year can really help with that sort of thing. Breeding timeline, fabulous resource. Every time that you start a new checklist, you can put a breeding code down for the species that you see exhibiting breeding behavior. Even if you've coded them in the past, that's okay. In fact, we would encourage you to put a breeding code down for them again. This helps us with figuring out the timing of when birds are breeding across the region. The more breeding codes that we have, the finer scale that we can look at. When are the birds arriving? When are they pairing up? When are they building their nests? When are the chicks fledged? That sort of thing. That's an ideal scenario, though. It is, more work to put down extra breeding codes. So if you find that doesn't work for you, that's okay. It's just an ideal scenario. You can still submit good quality data without doing that. The other thing to focus on is finding probable breeding codes. Possible breeding codes, like a bird that's in the right habitat or singing, they don't tell us a whole lot. Confirmed codes take more effort generally to find than probable codes. So if you're focused on finding probable codes, you'll get confirmed codes along the way, because let's be real, those are the most fun ones to find. And your atlasing will be a bit more efficient. So block-focused atlasing, that is where you can really kind of up your efficiency. Is if you pick a block and you just decide, okay, I'm going to get this block. I'm going to try and cover the habitats that are in this block. I'm going to try and find as many species as I can here. You can also just go around and, wherever you happen to feel like atlasing, you can atlas there. Nothing wrong with that at all. Both are useful, and atlasing should be fun. So do what works for you. But if you want to be the most effective, picking a block and finding out, which species still need breeding codes, that's going to be the most effective thing to do. The S7 code here, I've mentioned it before, very useful. If you do one visit and you find singing birds, come back a week later, find those birds again, and you now have probable status for all of those birds. You can use block species lists, which are available on the website. They have lists of all the birds that were found breeding in a block in both past atlases. This can really help you know what birds to expect, maybe even what habitats are there. If you're seeing that there's bobolinks and grasshopper sparrows, but you haven't found any, maybe there's grassland there that you've overlooked. Of course, it may also have just been developed, but it's a great way to kind of figure out what your targets should be. So how do you find a block then? There's 1,300 of them. There's a lot of choices. If you go on to the eBird website, you can go to Explore, and you can find different values for each of the block that will help you decide how much effort. If you can pick blocks that don't have a lot of effort in them yet, then that's where your personal efforts will be most useful. If you want to keep atlasing in a place that has been, it's got 1,000 hours of atlasing already, that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But your efforts will have more impact if you go somewhere with less effort from other people. So you can go on to eBird Explorer. You can look for the number of effort hours during the day or at night, the number of checklists that have been submitted there, or the number of confirmed species, or just species with breeding codes. And all of these things can help you decide, okay, this is a block that I think I would like to atlas at. Of course, you can also contact a county coordinator and ask them if they have recommendations. To do that, you just have to type in, for the email address, just write in the county name at mdbirds.org. So Baltimore at mdbirds.org, Anne Arundel, St. Mary's. You get the idea. We also have a list of priority and colonial species. This list is available on the website. We want a little bit more information for these species because they're declining or they're uncommon in Maryland and DC. We're looking for a precise location of where you found them. We'd like you to try a little extra harder to find confirmations of those species if you can. And for colonial species, we'd like to know how many nests were in the colony for each different species. And we'd like a general description of the habitat that you found the bird in and the nest, if you happen to find that. Now, some birds are really easy to document. You know, if you follow a robin or an oriole around, you'll probably find the nest before too long. Others, though, are more difficult. Sometimes this is just because they're good at hiding. Sometimes this is because they don't do a lot of the breeding behaviors. Vultures, for example, are very easy to see, very difficult to actually get breeding evidence for. So to help with this, the best thing to do really is to learn about that species' natural history. What kind of breeding behaviors do they show? What's their habitat? That sort of thing. That'll help you figure out what codes you should be focused on finding while you're out looking for them. Of course, there's a lot of species and that's a lot of reading. So to help out with that, you can use the block species lists. These are the lists that I mentioned earlier that have all of the species that were found from the past atlases in a block. You can scan that list. You can find the species that you think might be more challenging to try and document, and you can read up about those ones. And some species might require special effort beyond just like, you know, extra looking or extra knowledge about them. Things like owls, for example, require you to go out at night to have a good chance at finding them. So in summary, personally, man, atlasing is just the best. It is tremendously gratifying. Watching a bird and just sitting there and watching what it does, figuring out whether it's breeding or not, it's a window into their, you know, to their daily life. It's the best. It also gets you out into places where you may not be as likely to go, you know, away from the birding hotspots, just into kind of the, you know, random part of Maryland or DC. And you're doing all of this and contributing data which make a big difference in bird conservation. So if you want to contribute quality data, the best things to do, watch individual birds, you know, especially during the peak breeding period. 5 or 10 minutes will generally get you good breeding evidence for a species. Keep the time of year in mind for each species. It is different for each different species, but having a resource like the breeding timeline can help with that. And pay attention to block boundaries while you're out atlasing. This is something that's pretty easy to forget, but is really important for mapping the species distributions accurately. To really up the effectiveness of your atlasing, you know, pick a block and stick with it. Try and get, you know, the block species list. Try and find those species, as many of them as you can. You want to pick a block that hasn't got a lot of effort in it already to try and maximize your personal effort. And you want to look for probable codes wherever possible, because those are they're the best bang for your buck. That's all that I have today. I'm looking forward to chatting with you and answering your questions. Thanks very much.